The world oceans have about 20,000 pipelines across the bottom of the world's oceans. Divers assigned to treat any issues with these pipelines work at depths of up to 1,000 feet, which makes this one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. One such diver in Scotland, Chris, visits his fiancée, Marag, telling her he is going to another assignment on the bed of the North Sea to treat a pipeline. Like any normal person who loves her fiancé, she doesn't like the idea of Chris putting his life at risk for a job. Chris tries to console her that it is safe and somehow also thinks that telling her it is like astronauts going to space is going to make her feel better. Good thing she loves him enough to let him go on an adventure that he loves. Duncan is one of the oldest divers who work on this job. Seeing the changes in technology and equipment over time, and knowing he can casually sleep and wander in his night suit with a pillow around the workspace. 4 teams are assigned for the job, with Team A being Chris, Duncan, and Dave. Duncan has been with Chris ever since he joined, while Dave and Chris have never worked together. Even so, Dave is a bundle of joy on the job who doesn't smile much or beat around the bush, and likes to focus on the work. Chris's attempt at conversation with Dave fails, but Duncan is chill with Dave, and Dave speaks a few extra words around Duncan, explaining that they are good around each other. They are all sent to different tin pods where they spend their time before entering the bells that are sent down to the oceans. After doing the job, they are supposed to spend 3 days in that pod for decompression to not implode. In the tin, Chris pastes a picture of Marag near his bed, making Dave tell him to not let anything outside the tin distract him from his job once that door closes. Pretty cold for Chris, but the reason why Duncan doesn't react to Dave's cold attitude is because he has seen his sweet side as a dad to 2 girls. Once everything is settled and checked, the ship takes off into the ocean. As they travel, the teams have dinner in their tins. That is when Duncan tells them that this is his last rotation and he has been suggested to retire after this. Both Dave and Chris are moved by this, especially Chris, since Duncan has been his mentor since the start. Chris suggests Duncan take a management role, but he is just not that kind of person. Later at night, the ship reaches the right on top of the manifold and locks on its position there. Captain Andre evaluates the situation of the storm and shares the situation with Craig, but Craig tells him that this situation is going to be consistent around the North Sea, so they should not halt for it. Once locked in, Craig prepares to escort Team A first. The 3 of them wear their gear and secure all the equipment before starting to enter the bell. Duncan is going to handle the control from the bell, while Dave and Chris will go into the ocean to work on the pipeline. Once they are all in the bell, they close the door to be escorted down to the ocean. The bell is stopped at 300 feet into the ocean from where Dave first wears his headgear, gets the gas supply and communication control checked, and enters the water. The same is then followed by Chris. There's a camera in the sea for the dive control to also see the situation. Even in the intense situation, the crew likes to keep it lit as Craig jokes about hoping Duncan has his adult diaper on for the long shift. Chris and Dave drop off the bell. Chris has a hard time reading the compass and finding his way, but luckily he has Dave to guide him. Dave makes him follow his lead as they walk to get a hand on the power cable first, which is dropped by the dive control. Once they have the power cable, they walk to the manifold and connect the cable to it. Once the manifold is charged up, the lights turn on, increasing the visibility for Chris and Dave to work around. Duncan then guides Dave to prepare the pipelines for installation and Chris to head to well 3 for equalization. Duncan also keeps throwing more of the umbilical to not strain the connection between the divers and the bell. Chris enters the manifold and reaches the meter through the narrow paths. What none of Team A knows yet is that the ship crew has lost its hydroacoustics and is currently trying to stay in position. As Chris is working on the well, all the thrusters of the ship go offline. Luckily, Dave notices the ship moving and alerts Chris to get out of the manifold right away. On the ship, all the dynamic positioning is lost and the power has gone down. Hannah warns Andre that they are drifting out of control, so Craig alarms the team to abort the mission. Since the ship is moving, Duncan keeps throwing more of the cord to keep in touch with the 2 of them, but he eventually reaches the limit. Dave tells Chris to climb on top of the manifold, after which they will use their umbilical as a means to climb up and reach the bell. However, Chris's umbilical gets brutally stuck in one of the connections of the manifold, making him lose his gas supply too. This anchors the ship and bell for a while, but the cord is going to break any minute, and Chris is already on his backup supply, which only lasts for about 10 minutes. Dave tells Chris that the cord will break and they will lose communication, but he promises to come back and save him. All he has to do is find his way back on top of the manifold. Chris is responding, but the cord breaks and the ship drifts at a high pace, pulling Dave along while Chris falls. Dave travels up the cord while Duncan pulls the remaining of Chris's cord up, feeling distraught when he has to turn off the gas supply, knowing the probability of losing Chris forever is very high now. On the ship, the entire crew is tense as they have lost connections and sight to the bell or the divers. When one of the cams on the bell turns on, they are glad that at least Dave made it back to the bell. Luckily, none of the crew members is selfish and wants to escape. Everyone is thinking of ways to not drift far away from Chris, knowing he has a limited oxygen supply left. People suggest throwing the anchor, but Andre doesn't want to risk the anchor falling on any of the pipelines and causing greater damage. He tells others to find a way around to not drift away. 7 minutes left with oxygen, Chris finds himself stranded on the bed of the ocean with only a flare lighting a bit of his surroundings. He calls out for Duncan and Dave but has lost communication. Chris then starts looking for the manifold to climb on it, while even his compass is broken. On the ship, the crew has run its diagnostics and realized that the thrusters are still working fine. Andre tells Hannah that they can turn off the computer control and control the ship manually to keep it from drifting further. Hannah highlights how things getting out of control will put the entire ship at risk, but they both don't want to drift farther away from Chris either. Hannah eventually agrees that the both of them can together take control of the ship and move it back on top of the manifold. Chris finally finds his way to the manifold and starts climbing it with 4 minutes on him. When he finally reaches on top, his supply is starting to give in, and all he can remember is Morag telling him that she always goes into this state of fear, knowing the moment he goes into the water. He is not safe anymore. The last thing he recalls is her telling him to come back home while his eyes shut and he loses consciousness. Just like that, the flare loses its light. They finally manage to bring the ship back in the range of the manifold, so Mike sends the camera down to search for Chris. One of the members tells Andre that they need a hard reset to get the dynamic positioning working, but that takes hours. Andre sends him to find a way around that. As Mike and Craig look for Chris, they find him on top of the manifold. He appears to be alive, but he isn't breathing. His eyes are closed, his limbs are intact, and he is facing involuntary spasms from oxygen starvation in the brain. They are at an extremely crucial point, as it's been 7.5 minutes without oxygen now for Chris. The DPO guy finds a way to bypass the long route of reboot and rearrange the sequence of wiring of dynamic positioning to reset faster. He is confident that he can do it right, so Andre tells him to go for it. Craig tells Mike they can use the pinchers on the ROV to pick up Chris and carry him to the bell, but Mike doesn't want to use the pincers that are too dangerous to be used on living humans. Craig decides to take control of the ROV, seeing no other option. It takes some time to finally safe attach the pincher to his harness, but the moment he tries to pull Chris up, they get pulled back. Rerouting the camera, they see Chris attached himself to the cage of the manifold to not drift away by the ocean when he loses consciousness. A calculated move by him. Not having any other choice, they just set the camera back facing Chris as he has been out for about 16 minutes now. Duncan recalls their first rescue dive where it took them hours to find the bodies of the divers, but they weren't able to find the last body. It was concluded at the end that the body got carried away in the water. Not having a body to give, they decided to give his wife a shoebox filled with stuff cleaned out from that guy's locker. It sounds cold and baseless, which is why Duncan is not ready to do this to Morag. Dave consoles him that they will find Chris. The DPO guy seems to be the coolest guy who ends up rewiring the entire dynamic positioning system. He tries to restart the system, but it doesn't work. He checks the connections again and wires one of them properly again, making the system finally work. Once it is on, the ship is put back to auto, and he directs it to their lock-in position again. The connection with the bell is back online too, making Dave prepare to get back into the water again. As he lowers down, he can see Chris, but the bell needs to be a bit lower. The ship system locks in on position and the bell is lowered a bit. Once the situation is clear, Dave dives in and reaches Chris. He attaches Chris to himself and tries to climb up the umbilical. It is hard since Chris is heavy and unresponsive at the moment. However, Dave is trying his best. Due to the storm, the ship moves down a bit, making Craig warn Duncan to brace for an impact. The bell comes down and scratches against the top of the manifold where Dave and Chris were moments ago. It is only Dave's fast responses that have the two unscratched from the impact. As the bell goes back up again, Dave is luckily still connected to the cord and holding on to Chris. Dave is currently trying his best given the situation, but Duncan seems to be calm in action. He guides Duncan to go with the swell. Only climb when the bell comes down and hold tight when it moves up. Dave follows this and keeps on climbing up with this instruction in mind. It is still a hard job and he keeps slipping down to the weight and the force from the surrounding. Duncan encourages him to keep going. When they are near the bell, Duncan tells him to hold tight and wait and guides him to climb up the bell at the exact moment the bell comes down a bit. Finally on stage, Dave pulls up Chris and requests the wench. Pulling Chris's head out of the water, Duncan removes his headgear and finds him cold and blue due to the lack of oxygen. He resuscitates Chris multiple times, trying to revive his breathing. Just as he is about to lose hope, Chris finally starts breathing again. Pulling him completely out of the water and into the bell, Duncan helps Dave up too. Craig asks for Chris's status. Duncan tells him that he is breathing, but he is still unresponsive. He tries multiple times to wake Chris up, but Chris is not responding, even though his eyes are open and he is still breathing. As everyone fears that they are too late, Dave also gives it a go by telling Chris to either move his eyes or press his hand. Everyone feels shattered that they were too late, and Chris's brain was deprived of oxygen for 30 minutes, so he is probably brain dead. As Duncan and Dave sit back down in misery, they suddenly hear Chris calling out for Dave. The moment everyone gets to know Chris is responsive and talking, the whole crew erupts in happiness. Whether it's Dave or Duncan, the crew on the ship, or the other teams in the pods, each and everyone feels happy and relieved, showing true harmony as a team. As Craig sits back down, Duncan mentions he might have actually shit his pants, taking a slight hint to the adult diaper joke by Craig. Since the mission has been cut short, the bell is later pulled up and they are to spend their 3-day time of decompression. Chris is resting all this while, and the cold Dave is the one who has been caring for him and smiling towards him. When Chris gets to know he was out for about 40 minutes, even he wonders how he is still alive. He shares with Dave that it didn't feel much while he was dying. It was like dozing off to a peaceful sleep while being numb, but he felt sad for Morag. He felt like he had let her down by getting into this situation, even though he promised her that he would be safe. Dave seems to have an impact on these words too, as he tries to excuse himself from Chris after this. Chris stops him one last time to thank him for saving his life. Once Chris rests, Dave goes to where his bag is, opens it, and searches for the photo of his daughters. Pulling it out, he bursts into tears, thinking about going away from them forever. It seems like a turning point for Dave, who is always cold and about business. He has finally realized that keeping his personal life out of this pod was cold and disregarding when it was probably the thought of hurting Morag that kept Chris striving through. On the second day of decompression, Chris calls Morag telling her that the rotation was cut short due to a little accident, and he will be back the day after tomorrow. He doesn't even let her come to pick him, but Morag is happy that he is back and safe, unaware of what the little accident was. As they all get out after the last day of decompression, Chris asks Duncan if he still wants to go back after all that happened, to which Duncan responds affirmative. Chris suggests talking about staying for a little more, but Duncan dodges the conversation, telling him he forgot his pillow inside. When Chris leaves, Duncan gets back into the pod, staring at it, knowing his journey in this little tin has come to an end now. As he sits down to reminisce these last moments and digest the scenario, Craig calls in from the intercom, asking him how he is, and telling him how good of a man he is, showing how it is not only an emotional moment for Duncan, but also his longtime partner, Craig. Chris reaches back home, meeting an excited Morag. Upon asking what happened, he tells her that a diver got stranded on the seabed and had to be rescued. She asks him how that person is, making Chris tell her they seem to be fine now. Only this much conversation and Morag knows it was Chris who got stranded. It is a heart-shattering moment for her, realizing she almost lost him this time. Chris consoles her that he is fine now, but the intensity of her fear would never calm now. Being based on a true story, it is still not scientifically explainable how Chris bore no lasting physical or mental damage, even after being cut off from oxygen for about 29 minutes. This being a miracle, the three of them did go back just after 3 weeks to complete the task left unfinished, showing Chris's love for this exciting job still being unwavering.